Chapter 13. Coming up to the tree, I could see it was a huge bur oak. It wasn't tall, it was just the opposite, rather low and squatty. The top was a thick mass of large limbs, and it hadn't shed all of its leaves yet. It stood by itself in an old field. There was no other trees within 50 yards of it, and about 15 feet to the left were the remains of a barbed wire fence. An old gate hung by one rusty hinge from a large corner post, and I could tell that at one time a house had stood close by. Reuben saw me looking around.
"A long time ago, some Indians lived here and farmed these fields," he said.
I looked around the tree looking for the coon, but I could see very little in the dark shadows.
"Ain't no use in looking. He won't be there."
Rainey spoke up.
"This ain't the first time we've been to this tree."
Reuben told Rainey to shut up.
"You talk too much, Rainey."
In a whiny voice, Rainey said,
"Reuben, you know that coon ain't up in that tree. Make him pay off and let's go home. I'm getting tired."
I told Reuben I was going to climb that tree.
"Go ahead. Won't do you any good."
The tree was easy to climb. I looked all over it, on every limb and every dark place. I looked for a hollow. The ghost coon wasn't there. I climbed back down and scolded old Dan to stop his loud bawling and looked for little Ann. I saw her far up the old fence now, sniffing and running here and there, and I knew the ghost coon had pulled a real trick, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Little Ann had never barked treed. I knew if the coon was in the tree, she wouldn't still be searching for a trail. Old Dan started working again. My dogs covered the field. They circled and circled. They ran up and down the barbed wire fence on both sides, and I knew the coon hadn't walked that barbed wire. Ghost or no ghost, he couldn't do that. I walked over to the old gate and looked around. I sat down and stared into the tree, and little Ann came over to me. Old Dan gave up his search and came back to the tree and bawled a couple more times, so I scolded him again. Reuben came over, leering at me.
"You giving up?"
I didn't answer. Little Ann once again started searching for the lost trail. Old Dan went to help her. Rainey said,
"I told you you couldn't tree that ghost coon. Why don't you just pay off so we can go home?"
I told him I hadn't given up. My dogs were still hunting, and when they gave up, I would too. Reuben said,
"Well, we're not going to stay here all night."
Looking back to the tree, I thought perhaps I'd overlooked something, and I told Reuben I was going to climb it again. He laughed.
"Well, go ahead. Won't do any good. You climbed it once. Aren't you satisfied?"
"No, I'm not satisfied. I just don't believe in ghost coons." Reuben said,
"Well, I don't believe in ghosts either, but facts are facts. To tell you the truth, I've climbed that tree a dozen times, and there just ain't no place in it for a coon to hide."
Rainey spoke up.
"Our old blue hound has treed that ghost coon in that tree more times than one. Maybe you two don't believe in ghosts, but I do. Why don't you pay off so we can get out of here?"
"I'm going to climb it one more time, and if I can't find him, I'll pay off." Climbing up again, I searched, and when I got through, I knew the ghost coon wasn't in that tree. And when I came down, I saw my dogs had given up. Well, that took the last bit of resistance out of me, and I knew if they couldn't find the ghost coon, I couldn't. Taking the 2 $1 bills out of my pocket, I walked over to Reuben. Little Ann was by my side. I handed my money over and said, "Well, you won it, fair and square." With a grin on his face, Reuben took my money.
"I bet this'll break your old grandpa's heart."
I didn't reply. Reaching down, I caught little Ann's head in my hands, and I looked into her warm, friendly eyes, and I said, "It's all right, little girl. We haven't given up yet. We'll come back. We may never catch that ghost coon, but we'll run him until he leaves the country." She licked my hands and whined. A small breeze began to stir. Glancing up into the tree, I saw some leaves shaking. I said to Reuben, "Looks like wind's coming up. It may blow up a storm. We better head for home." Just as I turned, little Ann threw up her head and whined. Her body grew stiff and taut. I watched her. She tested the wind. I knew she had scented something in that breeze, and stiff-legged, head high in the air, she started walking towards that tree. Almost there, she turned back and stopped. I knew she caught the scent, but could only catch it when a breeze came. Looking at Reuben, I said, "I haven't lost that $2 yet." Another breeze drifted out of the river bottoms, and little Ann caught the scent again, and slowly she walked straight to the large gate post, rearing up on it with her front feet, and bawled the most beautiful tree bark I ever heard in my life. Old Dan, not understanding why little Ann was bawling, stood and looked. He walked over to the post, reared up on it, and sniffed, and then he raised his head, and he shook the dead leaves in that bur oak tree with his deep voice. I looked at Rainey. I laughed and I said, "There's your ghost, coon. Now what do you think of my dogs?" For once, he made no reply. Going over to the post, I saw it was a large black locust put there many years ago to hang the gate. Looking up at the tree, I saw how the ghost coon had pulled his trick. One large, long limb ran out and hung directly over the gate. It was a drop of a good 12 feet from that branch to the top of the gate post, but I knew we weren't after an ordinary coon, that this here was the ghost coon. I said to Reuben, "Boost me up, and I'll see if that post is hollow." After breaking off a long gypsum weed to use as a prod, I got up on Reuben's shoulders and he raised me up. The post was hollow. Not knowing how far down that hole went, I started the switch down. About halfway, I felt something soft, and I gave it a hard jab. Well, I heard him coming. He boiled out right into my face, and I let go of everything and hit the ground, and I rolled over on my back and looked up. And for a split second, the ghost coon stayed on top of the post, and then he jumped. My dogs were on him the instant he hit the ground, and the fight was on. I knew the coon didn't stand a chance, as he wasn't in the waters of the river, but he didn't give up easily, even though he was on dry land. He was fighting for his life, and a good account he made of it. He fought his way to freedom and made it back to the bur oak tree. He was a good 6 foot up the side when old Dan, leaping high in the air, caught him and pulled him on back down. At the foot of the tree, the fight was on. Again, the ghost coon fought his way free, and this time he made it and disappeared into the dark shadows of the tree. Old Dan was furious. Never before have I seen a coon get away from him. I told Reuben I'd climb up and run him out. And as I started climbing, I saw little Ann go to one side and old Dan to the other. My dogs would never stay together when they treat a coon, so that any way he left a tree he'd be met by one of them. About halfways up, far out on a limb, I found the ghost coon. As I started towards him, my dogs stopped bawling. I heard something I'd heard many times. The sound was that of the cry of a small baby. It was the cry of a ring-tail coon when he knows it's the end of the trail. I had never liked to hear this cry, but it was all in the game, the hunter and the hunted. As I sat there on the limb, looking at the old fella, he cried again, and something come over me. I didn't want to kill him. I hollered down and told Reuben I didn't want to kill the ghost coon, and he hollered back, "Are you crazy?" I told him I wasn't crazy, I just didn't want to kill him. I climbed down. Reuben was mad. "What's the matter with you?" "Nothing," I told him. "I just don't have the heart to kill the coon." I told him there were plenty more, but why kill him? He had lived here a long time, and more than one hunter had listened to the voices of his hounds bawling on his trail. Rainey piped up. "Well, he's chicken-livered, that's what it is." I didn't like that, but not wanting to argue, I didn't say anything. Reuben said, "Well, I'll go up and run him out." "Well, I won't let my dogs kill him," I said. Reuben glared at me. "Well, I'm going up and running that coon out. If you stop your dogs, I'm going to beat you half to death." "Well, do it anyway, Reuben," Rainey put in. "Well, I'm a good mind to." Just as Reuben started to climb the tree, old Dan growled. He was staring off into the darkness. Something was coming. "What's that?"
I said. Well, I don't know. Don't sound like nothing I ever heard. It's ghosts. Let's get away from here,
Rainey said. An animal was coming out of the darkness. It was walking slowly in an odd way, as if it was working sideways. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. As the animal came closer, Rainey said, Why, it's old Blue. How did he get loose? It was a big blue tick hound, and around his neck was a piece of rope about 3 foot long. One could see that the rope had been gnawed in two, and the frayed end had come entangled in a fairly large dead limb. Dragging the limb had made the dog look kind of odd. I felt much better when I found out what it was. The blue tick hound was just like the Pritchards, mean and ugly. He was a big dog, tall and heavy. His chest was heavy and thick. He came up growling. The hair on his back was standing straight up, and he walked stiff-legged around Dan, showing his teeth. I told Rainey he better get a hold of his dog, or there's sure to be a fight. You better get a hold of your dog. I'm not worried about old Blue. He can take care of himself. I said no more. Don't make any difference now whether you kill the ghost coon or not. Old Blue will take care of him. I knew the killing of the coon was out of my control, but I didn't want to see him die, and I said to Reuben, Well, just give me back my $2 and I'll go home. I can't keep you from killing him, but I don't have to stay and see it. Reuben, don't give him his money. He ain't killed the ghost coon. That's right, you ain't, and I won't let you now, even if you wanted to. I told them that my dogs had treed the ghost coon, and that was the bet, to tree the ghost coon. No, it wasn't. You said you'd kill him. It was no such thing. I've done all I said that I would. Reuben walked up in front of me. I ain't about to give you your money. You didn't win it fair. Now what you gonna do about it? I looked into his mean eyes, and I started to make some reply, but decided against it. He saw my hesitation and said, You better get your dogs and get out of here before you get whipped. In a loud voice, Rainey said, Bloody his nose, Reuben. I was scared. I couldn't whip Reuben. He was too big for me. I started to turn and leave when I thought of what my father had told them. Well, you better remember what my grandpa said, I reminded him. He'll do just what he said he would. Reuben didn't hit me. He just grabbed me and with his brute strength threw me down on the ground. He had me on my back with my arms outspread. He had a knee on each arm, and I made no effort to fight back, and I was scared. Well, if you say one word to your grandpa about this, I'll catch you hunting some night and take my knife to you. Looking up into his ugly face, I knew he would do just what he said. I told him to let me up, and I'd go and not say anything to anyone. Don't let him up, Reuben. Beat the heck out of him, or hold him, and I'll do it. Just then I heard growling and a commotion off to one side. The blue hound had finally gotten into a fight with old Dan. Turning my head sideways, I could see them standing on their hind legs, tearing and slashing at each other, and the weight of the big hound pushed old Dan over. I told Reuben to let me up so we could stop the fight. While my dog is whipping yours, I think I'll just work you over. So saying, he jerked my cap off and started whipping me in the face with it. I heard Rainey yell, Reuben, they're killing old Blue. Reuben jumped up off me. I clambered up and looked over to the fight, and what I saw thrilled me. Faithful little Ann, female though she was, had gone to the assistance of old Dan. I knew my dogs were very close to each other. Everything they did was done as a combination, but I never expected this. I could see that little Ann's jaws were glued to the throat of the big hound, and she would never loosen that deadly hold until the last breath of life was gone. Old Dan was tearing and slashing at the soft belly, and I knew the destruction his long, sharp teeth were causing. Again, Rainey yelled, Reuben, they're killing him! They're killing old Blue! Do something! Reuben darted over to one side, grabbed my axe from the ground, and said in a low voice, I'll kill them damned hounds. At the thought of what he was going to do with the axe, I screamed and ran for my dogs. Reuben was about 10 feet ahead of me, bent over, running with the axe held out in front of him, and I knew I could never get to them in time. and I was screaming.
No, Reuben, no!
I saw the little stick when it came whipping up from the ground. As if it was alive, it caught between Reuben's legs and I saw him fall, and I ran right on by. Reaching the dog fight, I saw the big hound was almost gone. He had long since ceased fighting. His body lay stretched full length on the ground. I grabbed old Dan's collar and pulled him back. It was different with little Ann. Pull as I might, she wouldn't let go of that hound's throat. Her jaws were locked. I turned old Dan loose, and getting astride of little Ann, I pried her jaws apart with my hands. Old Dan had darted back in. Grabbing his collar again, I pulled him off to one side. The blue hound lay where he was. I thought perhaps he was already dead, but then I saw him move a little. Still holding my dogs by their collars, I looked back. I couldn't understand what I saw. Reuben was laying where he had fallen. His back was towards me, and his body was bent in a U shape. Rainey was standing on the other side, staring down. I hollered and asked Rainey, "What's the matter?" He didn't answer. He stood just as though he was in a trance, staring down at Reuben. I hollered again, and he still didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn my dogs loose. They'd go for the hound again. And again I hollered at Rainey, asking him to come and help me. He neither moved nor answered. Well, I had to do something. Looking around, my glance fell on the old barbed wire fence, and I led my dogs to it. Holding on to their collars with one hand, I worked a rusty barbed wire backwards and forwards against a staple until it broke. Running the end of it under their collars, I tied them up. They made 2-3 lunges towards the hound, but the wire had held. I walked over and stopped at Rainey's side, and I asked, "What's the matter?" He didn't say a word. I could see that Rainey was paralyzed with fright. His mouth and eyes were wide open, his face was white as chalk, and I laid my hand on his shoulder. At the touch of my hand, he jumped and screamed. Still screaming, he turned and started running. I watched him until he disappeared in the darkness. Looking down at Reuben, I saw what had paralyzed Rainey. When Reuben had tripped, he had fallen on the axe, and as it entered his stomach, the sharp blade had sunk to the eye of the double-bit axe. Turning my back to the horrible sight, I closed my eyes. The muscles of my stomach knotted and jerked. A nauseating sickness spread over my body, and I couldn't look at him. I heard Reuben whisper. Turning around, I knelt down by his side with my back to the axe. I couldn't understand what he was whispering. Kneeling down closer, I heard and understood, and in a faint voice he said, "Take it out of me." I hesitated. Again he pleaded, "Please, take it out." Turning around, I saw his hands were curled around the protruding blade as if he himself had tried to put it from his stomach. How he did it, I'll never know. Putting my hands over his and pressing down, I felt the axe and pulled it from the wound. The blood gushed, and I felt the warm heat as it spread over my hands, and again the sickness came over me, and I stumbled to my feet and stepped back a few paces. Seeing a movement from Reuben, I thought he was going to get up. With his hands, he pushed himself halfways, and his eyes were wide open, staring straight at me, stopping in his effort of getting up, and still staring at me, his mouth open, as if to say something. Words never came. Instead, a large red bubble slowly worked its way out of his mouth and burst. He fell back to the ground. I knew he was dead. Scared, not knowing what to do, I called for Rainey. I got no answer. I called his name again and again, and I could not get a reply. My voice echoed in the darkness of the silent night. A cold chill ran over my body. I suppose it is natural at a time like that for a boy to think of his mother, and I thought of mine. I wanted to get home. Going over my dogs, I glanced to where the blue hound was. He was trying to get up. I was glad he wasn't dead. Picking up my lantern, I thought of my axe. I left it. I didn't care if I ever saw it again. Knowing I couldn't turn my dogs loose, I broke off and enough of the wire to lead them, and as I passed underneath the branches of the bur oak tree, I looked up into the dark foliage. I could see the bright eyes of the ghost coon. Everything that happened on this terrible night was because of his very existence, but it wasn't his fault. I also knew he was a silent witness to that horrible scene. Behind me lay the still body of a young boy. On my left, a blue tick hound lay torn and bleeding. Even after all that had happened, I could feel no hatred for that ghost coon, and I wasn't sorry that I let him live. Arriving home, I awakened my mother and father. Starting at my grandfather's mill, I told them everything that had happened, and I left nothing out. My mother had started crying long before I had completed my story. Pa said nothing but just sat and listened. When I finished, he kept staring down at the floor in deep thought. I could hear the sobbing of my mother in the silence, and I walked over to her, and she put her arms around me and said, "My poor boy." Getting to his feet, Pa reached for his coat and hat. Ma asked him where he was going. "Well, I'll have to go up there. I'm going to go get Grandpa, for he's the only man in the country that has authority to move the body." Looking at me, he said, "You go across the river and get Old Man Lowry. You may as well go on up and tell the Bufords too. Tell them to meet us at your grandfather's place." I hurried to carry that sad message. The following day was a nasty one. A slow, cold drizzle had settled in. Feeling trapped indoors, I prowled from room to room. I couldn't understand why my father hadn't come back from the Pritchards. I sat by the window, watching the road. Understanding my feelings, Ma said, "Billy, I wouldn't worry. He'll be back before long. It takes time for things like this." "I know, but you'd think he would have come back by now." Time dragged slowly by. Late in the afternoon, I saw Pa coming. Our old mule was jogging along. Water was shooting out from under his feet in small squirts at every step. Pa had tied the halter rope around the mule's neck. He was sitting humped over with his hands jammed deep in the pockets of his patched and worn mackinaw. I felt sorry for him. He was soaking wet, tired, sleepy, and hungry. "Tell him, Ma, he's here." I grabbed my jumper and cap and ran out to the gate and waited. I was going to ask him what had happened at the Pritchard, but on seeing his tired face and wet clothes, I said, "Pa, you better go on up to the fire. I'll take care of the mule and do the feeding and the milking." "Thank you, Billy. That'll be fine." After doing the chores, I hurried to the house. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out what had happened. Walking into the front room, I saw my father had changed clothes and he was standing in front of the fireplace drinking coffee. "Boy, that's some bad weather out there, ain't it?" I said it was and asked him about Reuben. "Well, we went to the old tree and we got Reuben's body," Pa said. "We were on our way back to the Pritchards when we met them. They were just this side of their place. They had started to look for him. Rainey was so dazed when he got home, they couldn't make out what he was trying to say, but they knew it must have been something pretty bad. They wanted to know what had happened, and I did my best to explain the accident. It's hit old man Pritchard pretty hard. I felt sorry for him." Ma asked how Miss Pritchard was taking it. Pa said he didn't know, as he never did get over to see any of the women folk. He said they were the funniest bunch he'd ever seen. He couldn't understand them. There wasn't one tear shed that he could see. All the men stayed out at the barn. They never had been invited in for a cup of coffee or anything. Ma asked if they were having a funeral. "They have a graveyard right there on the place. Old man Pritchard said that they would take care of anything and didn't want to bother anyone. He said it'd be too far for anyone to come, and it was bad weather, too." Ma said she couldn't help feeling sorry for Miss Pritchard and wished they were more friendly, and I asked Pa about Rainey. Well, according to what old man Pritchard said, Rainey just couldn't get over the shock. They were figuring on taking him into town to see the doctor. And in a stern voice, Pa added, Billy, I don't want you fooling around with the Pritchards any more. You have plenty of country around here, so you don't have to go over there hunting. I told him I wouldn't. I felt bad about the death of Reuben. I didn't feel like hunting, or I kept having bad dreams. I couldn't forget the way he looked at me just before he died. I moped and wandered around in a daze. I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what to do. I explained my feelings to Mother. Billy, I feel the same way, and I'd like to do something to help, but I guess there's nothing we can do. There's people like the Pritchards all around the hills. They live in little worlds of their own and are all alone. They don't like to have outsiders interfere. I told my mother that I'd been thinking about how dangerous it was to carry an axe while hunting, and I decided I'd save a few coon hides and get a good gun. Boy, I shouldn't have mentioned getting a gun, 'cause Mother got sitting hen mad. You're not getting a gun, and I won't have that at all. I told you a long time ago you could have one when you're 21, and I mean just that. I worry enough with you out there in the hills at all hours of night, running and jumping, but I couldn't stand it if I knew you had a gun with you. No, sir, you can forget about that. Yes, ma'am, I said, and then I sulked off to my room. Lying on my bed trying to figure out what I could do to help, I glanced over the wall. There, tied in a small bundle, was just what I needed. Some time back, my sisters had made some flowers for Decoration Day. They had given me a small bouquet for my room, and taking them down I could see they'd faded a little and looked a little old, but they were still quite pretty. I blew the dust off and straightened up the crinkled petals, and putting them inside my shirt, I left the house. I hadn't gone far when I heard something behind me. It was my dogs. I tried to tell them that I wasn't going hunting, that I just had a little business to attend to, and if they'd go back, I'd take them out that night. It was of no use. They wouldn't understand. Circling around through the flats, I came to the hollow above the Pritchard's place. Down below me, I could see the graveyard and the fresh mound of dirt. As quietly as I could, I started easing myself down the mountainside. Old Dan loosed a rock, and the further it bounced, the louder it got, and it slammed up against a post oak tree and sounded like a gunshot. Well, I held my breath and watched in the house, and no one came out. I glared at old Dan. He wagged his tail, and just to show off, he sat down on his rear and started digging at a flea with his hind leg. The way his leg was thumping in the leaves, anyone would have heard it for a mile. Well, I waited until he quit thumping before starting on. Reaching the bottoms, I had about 20 yards to clear it across, but the grass and brush was pretty thick. Laying down on my stomach with my heart beating like a trip hammer, I wiggled my way to Reuben's grave. I laid the flowers on the fresh mound of dirt, and then turned around and scooted for the timber. Just as we reached the mountain top, my foot slipped and I kicked loose a large rock, and down the mountainside it rolled, and this time the blue tick hound heard the noise. He came out from under the house bawling, and I heard a door slam and Miss Pritchard come out, and she stood looking this way and that. The hound ran up to the graveyard and started sniffing and bawling, and Miss Pritchard followed him. Seeing the flowers on Reuben's grave, she picked them up and looked at them. She scolded the hound, and then, looking up the hillside, I knew she couldn't see me because the timber was too thick, but I felt uncomfortable anyway. Scolding the hound again, she knelt down and arranged the flowers on the grave, and taking one more look at the hillside, she started away. Halfway to the house, I saw her reach down and gather the long cotton skirt in her hand and dab at her eyes. I felt much better after paying my respects to Reuben. Everything looked a touch brighter, and I didn't have that funny feeling anymore. All the way home, my dogs kept running out in front of me. They'd stop and turn around and look back at me. I had to smile, for I knew what they wanted. I stopped and petted them a little and told them as soon as I got home and had my supper, we'd be going hunting. End of chapter 13.